plug for the book, but the nature of the book has to do with andragogy, the education, what I'm doing now, the education of peace builders and peacemakers throughout the world, which is what I do virtually and which is what I do residentially at the university here. But more importantly, what it does is to look at an attempt to talk about peace education within state stabilization, right? We need a secure state. If the state is destabilized, then you're not going to be able to be afforded the simple luxuries, right? If you attain absolute security, then you do so at the expense of infringing on rights, privacy rights and such, right? The state becomes totalitarian and authoritarian here. There is no state here, and this is, we're aiming for some point in the middle. The point being that with respect to national security interests, if you participate in acts of torture, your participation in acts of torture are invariably going to be leaked to the public, right? So that the thought that you can do it in private is invariably, in some way, going to be leaked to the public. And insofar as it is leaked to the public, you potentially swing the pendulum to the destabilization and ultimate collapse of the state. Because that practice, the practice of violating human rights, and we recognize that this is a first-generation human rights, right? A freedom from torture. You violate the first-generation human rights insofar as you nationally endorse, albeit covertly, an act of torture. You undermine the stabilization of the state, because the truth is you cannot secure the privacy of the practice, as was evident in, at least within the U.S., as was evident in the leak of the photos, and also, as I said in the last, I don't know, hour, maybe 2 hours of the video, as was, and again, not a hostile attack against the candidate at all, just a FYI, when Bachmann made sort of the intimation that it was probably because of enhanced interrogation tactics that Osama bin Laden was captured, right? You can't do that. You can't say that, right? Because that insinuation can be used and will be used to further destabilize the state, right? So, you know, as far as national security goes, nothing undermines national security more than the practice of torture, right? So I hope that that's exceedingly clear. All right, now we move to the next page. So there was an article that was written in the Washington Post by two staff writers, Dana Priest and Barton Gellman, and the article, if my citation is right, was from December 26, 2002. And this seemed to be a very, very important article in which there was allegations that the United States of America had been participating in the use of enhanced interrogation practices. And I wanted to take a little bit of time, and I've given you links so you can actually read the article for yourself. It's not long. It was a few, like maybe 5 or 6 pages. It wasn't too long. So I'm going to present the article, and then there was a rebuttal to the article. I'm going to present the rebuttal, and then that exchange, the argument from Priest and Gellman, and then the rebuttal to that argument, and then we'll conclude this account of torture. So this is the Priest and Gellman. This is the Priest and Gellman article, and it was called, the title of the article is right underneath, "The U.S. Decries Abuse but Defends Interrogation," right? Here's the accusation. Here's the accusation. Remember, this article is a bit dated now. It's quick how quickly time passes. It's a bit dated now, but it is a seminal sort of critique. It made its way, the article made its way into the book, and now it's making its way into the virtual community. So I think it is a good point-counterpoint discussion. There's a clear accusation launched against the United States government for its endorsement and participation in acts of torture, and then there is a clear response, not necessarily from the government, but from the National Security Council spokesman Sean McCormick. So yeah. So we'll talk about the back and forth between these two states in a second. So the first point is the article challenges the notion of stress and duress, right? It challenges the notion of stress and duress, right? So it challenges the notion of stress and duress techniques. 2, alleges that stress and duress techniques are the same as torture. We've seen this already, right? So hopefully you're starting to see sort of the process, right? It's simple. The act is an act of torture. We go through the second type of denial, interpretive denial. We reconstruct, redefine the act, not as an act of torture, but as an act of enhanced interrogation, as an act of coercive interrogation, as an act of stress and duress, as an act of blah, 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 what have you, right? So the authors, Priest and Gelman, argued that stress and duress, right, and I'll just abbreviate S&D, right, stress and duress were really acts of torture. That we're not talking about stress and duress, that we're talking about torture, right? And I'm summarizing and condensing the argument quite a bit, right? So that's the second point. The third point was that the author accuses the U.S. government of participating and condoning acts of torture at Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan, right? So there is an instance in a location where they say, at this particular location, the United States government is practicing and utilizing this interrogation tactic, this act of torture, right? So charges the U.S. government with participation in acts of torture, right? So the allegation is that the U.S. government is participating in acts of torture, and the authors attempt to justify that accusation. You can see that this is a pretty charged allegation, right? This is a pretty charged allegation, and the Washington Post is a reputable publication. So you can anticipate, and in a second I'll go through the back and forth in a second. I just want to list initially sort of the process, and we've seen this before, right? In the Landau Commission report, rather than calling it stress and duress, they called it coercive interrogation. That was reinterpreted so that it wasn't sounded, it didn't have affinity with torture, to obviously shield the government from international sanctions, right? Last bullet point at the first half. The contrast to the detention center, in contrast to the detention center at Guantanamo Bay, where military lawyers, news reporters, and the Red Cross received occasional access to monitor prisoner conditions. So at least in Guantanamo Bay, there were, according to the article, the ability for Red Cross international agencies, I guess Amnesty International and such, were able to monitor prisoner conditions and treatment. The CIA's overseas interrogation facilities are off limits to outsiders, and often even go to other government agencies. There's a sense in which the quote-unquote practices of stress and duress, according to the authors, were outsourced, right? So there is a sense in which, and you know, that is a good conceptual, I'm sure someone's written a scholarly article on it. I have no interest in writing it, but maybe one of you might find it interesting to do sort of an analytic account of outsourcing torture, right? So that's the allegation, is that really not only was it practiced at this particular location, but third parties were banned, were prohibited from monitoring the prisoners themselves. And furthermore, even the larger allegation was that prisoners were outsourced to third parties for stress and duress practices, right? So that prisoners, or detainees we should say, detainees were outsourced to third-party interrogation, IST, third-party interrogationists, right? And we can imagine what that would be, right? If we send the detainee to a state that's known for torturing, the acts of torture that we might not participate in, this is all sort of hearsay, and I'm sure it's not hearsay, it's the Washington Post, right? I mean, so there must have been some, and I'm sure there's tons of